On November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man bought a one-way plane ticket. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. He wore a dark suit, a black tie, and carried a briefcase. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He was polite to the flight attendants. And then, somewhere over the forests of the Pacific Northwest, he jumped out of a plane with $200,000 strapped to his body. He was never seen again. 50 years later, the FBI still has no answer. This is case number 1, the muted file. Northwest Orient Flight 305 departed Portland, Oregon at 2:50 p.m. It was a short hop, Portland to Seattle, less than an hour in the air. 36 passengers, 6 crew. Nobody noticed the man in seat 18C at first. He was quiet, well-dressed, mid-40s maybe, dark sunglasses. He looked like a businessman heading home for the holidays. About 20 minutes after takeoff, he handed a note to Florence Schaffner, one of the flight attendants. She assumed it was a phone number. It happened to flight attendants. She slipped it into her pocket without reading it. The man leaned over and said, quietly, calmly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence read it. The note said he had a bomb in his briefcase. He wanted $200,000 in cash, roughly $1.4 million in today's money. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 front, 2 back, and he wanted a fuel truck waiting in Seattle. Then he opened his briefcase just enough for her to see. Red cylinders, wires, something that looked very much like what he said it was. She relayed the message to the cockpit. The pilot, Captain William Scott, radioed Seattle. Seattle contacted Northwest Orient's president, and the decision was made: give him what he wants. The plane circled Seattle for 2 hours while the money was gathered. 21 pounds of used $20 bills, all photographed and logged by the FBI. The parachutes were sourced and loaded. At 5:24 p.m., Flight 305 landed in Seattle. The passengers were told there was a mechanical issue. They were calm. They had no idea. The money and parachutes were delivered. The passengers were released, and then Dan Cooper told the crew to take off again. Destination, Mexico City. But there was a condition. They had to fly low, below 10,000 feet, slow, under 150 knots, flaps down, landing gear down. The plane configured almost for landing. Captain Scott told him this configuration would burn fuel fast. They'd never make Mexico. Cooper said they'd refuel in Reno, Nevada. The plane took off at 7:40 p.m. The cabin was empty except for the crew and Cooper. At 8:13 p.m., somewhere over southwest Washington state, a warning light lit up in the cockpit. The rear air stair, the fold-down steps at the back of the plane, had been activated. Captain Scott got on the intercom. He asked if Cooper needed assistance. There was no answer. At 8:24 p.m., the plane lurched slightly. A change in pressure, a subtle shift in the aircraft's tail. Someone had jumped. When the crew finally looked, Cooper was gone. The money was gone. The parachutes, 2 of them, were gone. And outside, in the dark, in the rain, in a forest that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, there was nothing. What followed was the largest manhunt in FBI history at the time. Military aircraft, search helicopters, ground teams combing the forests of southwest Washington. For weeks, then months, they found nothing. No body, no parachute, no briefcase, no sign that anyone had ever landed in that forest at all. The FBI did have some clues. The money, all $200,000 of it, had been cataloged, every serial number recorded. They distributed the list to banks across the country. Instructions: if these bills show up, call us immediately. For 9 years, nothing. Then, in February 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was digging on the banks of the Columbia River, about 30 miles from where Cooper jumped. He found something buried in the sand, a small bundle of cash, rubber banded, rotting, water damaged. The serial numbers matched. Exactly 294 $20 bills from D.B. Cooper's ransom money, found on the banks of a river almost a decade later. But this discovery raised more questions than it answered. The money was found upstream from where experts believed Cooper would have landed. The bills were scattered, not bundled the way they'd been packed. The rubber bands had rotted in a way that suggested years of water exposure. Had the money washed downriver? Had Cooper buried it there? Had someone else found it first and spent the rest? Nobody knows. The FBI interviewed over 1,000 suspects over the decades. They used handwriting analysis, psychological profiling, DNA from the tie Cooper left behind on the plane. Yes, he left his tie. They extracted a partial DNA profile from it in 2001. They ran it against databases. No match. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI officially suspended its active investigation. The case remains, to this day, the only unsolved commercial airline hijacking in American history. So who was Dan Cooper, and what happened to him? There are 3 dominant theories, and none of them have ever been proven. Theory 1. He died in the jump. The conditions that night were brutal. It was dark, it was raining. The temperature at jump altitude was -7 degrees Celsius. Cooper was wearing a business suit and loafers, not exactly skydiving attire. He had no helmet, no gloves, no survival gear. Investigators believe he jumped somewhere over the Cascade foothills, rugged, heavily forested terrain. Even an experienced parachutist would struggle to survive that jump in those conditions. Many experts believe Cooper's body simply sank into the forest floor, eaten by the land over decades. His bones, if they exist, are out there somewhere in 200 miles of wilderness. His money, minus those 300 bills, decomposed with him. Theory 2. He survived and lived out his life in anonymity. This is the one everyone wants to believe. Some investigators believe Cooper had military experience, possibly a paratrooper or special forces. The way he spoke about the plane's mechanics, the way he requested 2 sets of parachutes, possibly to make investigators think he'd take a hostage. The calm, the precision. If he survived, he had roughly a week before authorities had his photograph circulated widely. He could have made his way to a road, a car, a new identity, and spent the rest of his life quietly, anonymously, knowing he'd pulled off the only successful commercial airline hijacking in history. The 300 bills on the riverbank? Buried as an emergency stash, forgotten, or abandoned when he realized the serial numbers were known. Theory 3. Someone else found the money. What if Cooper died, but someone else stumbled onto his body and his cash long before the FBI did? What if they took most of the money, spent it slowly, carefully, over years, and dumped what they couldn't use on the riverbank? This would explain why only a fraction of the bills ever surfaced. It would explain why no body was ever found. If someone found Cooper, they may have buried him or moved him. It would mean that somewhere out there, someone is sitting on a secret they've kept for 50 years. Dan Cooper, or whoever he really was, boarded a plane with a briefcase and a plan. He executed it with almost impossible calm. He disappeared into one of the most remote landscapes in America. And despite 50 years of investigation, despite the FBI, the military, the amateur sleuths, the documentaries, the books, the theories, we still don't know who he was. We don't know if he lived. We don't know if he died. We don't know where the money went. What we do know is this. Somewhere in a forest or a river or a grave or a living room, the truth exists. It just hasn't been allowed to speak. This file remains open. I'm the muted file. New case every week. If you have a theory, leave it below. Someone always knows something. Subscribe and stay curious.